Hello. Doesn't seem to work for the moment, but meanwhile, let me plus près du micro. At this time of day, my voice is a little tired. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'd like to compliment them on the organization of an absolutely amazing event with just one drawback, which they invited too many people who are too smart. And so it's been a very heavy cognitive load on all of you and certainly on me. But still, it's better to have an over-rich conference than to have a mediocre conference. Before I start talking about creativity, I'd like to make, I'm cheating a little bit, I'd like to make 4 very extremely brief comments, 1 sentence each. The first comment is that one thing that hasn't been said is that the people who created the technology are not all capitalist monsters. They're actually scientists and technologists who are actually actively curious about solving a very difficult problem, which they, to some extent, did. So this curiosity is part of the dynamics of the field. Shouldn't be forgotten. Second comment, I've heard many people say it's a tool or not a tool. My own metaphor is that of the prosthesis. I think that AI systems are something like prosthesis, more than an ordinary tool that you manipulate at will, and not, of course, autonomous things at all. Third comment is that for some reason no one mentioned, as far as I know, because I must have missed some stuff, the really deep problem of AI companions. I think AI companions are even a worse threat than autonomous weapons, and I think it should be part of our ethical and political worries. The fourth thing is a message of hope, which is the following. I think that the human species as a whole is incredibly resilient. And I do accept the fact that right now it's getting a beating from big tech and from all these other things that are happening. But just like forest fires, like you had in Greece, summer after summer, it won't be extinguished. It will be born again. And I think we're already seeing that. So we can both recognize the reality of those threats, of those yes, pretty horrible things that are that are coming our way, but still think that there's no reason to think that humanity is just going to be crushed forever. It will rise again. So those were my preliminary remarks, and now I set my stopwatch, and now I have half an hour to talk about creativity, problem solving, and artificial intelligence. So at the start, I should say that I am taking creativity in the more restricted sense, as opposed to one gentleman said, and I agree with him, that creativity is not only about creating great musical and literary masterpieces, nor is it about solving great scientific or conceptual problems. But this is what I have mostly in mind. I will not be talking about creativity in the wider sense, although maybe some of what I'm saying will also apply to that. So this is the outline. A brief introduction about, say, the strategy I'm going to follow. Then I'm going to talk about human intelligence. Then I'm going to talk about creativity, problem solving, and what I call, horrible word, situationality. And finally, I'm going to talk about creativity for AI. So, this is my book in French, the original book, and there's an Italian translation, Arab translation, and just now a Mandarin translation that came out just in Taiwan. Pretty proud of that one. So, introduction. So, first of all, intelligence and creativity as two concepts or two problems have a certain general kinship. In both cases, you ask whether for P equals intelligence or P equals creativity, you ask, is for some X different from human, does it have the predicate or the capability P? So is a machine or can a machine be intelligent? Are machines intelligent? And pretty much similarly, can a machine be creative? Are machines that we know creative? Will they one day become creative? So the problems, the well-worn problems of whether machines can be intelligent, I mean, the same kind of dialectic can apply more or less to creativity. And for me, it's been a heuristic once I started thinking about creativity, which is quite recently. I should tell you that I've worked on, I've spent more hours asking myself whether a machine can be intelligent than I've spent on whether machines can be creative. For me, it's a pretty new field, and I hope you will forgive my naivete on the topic of creativity. It seems that in both cases, we run into some sort of conundrum. The obstacles are the following. When you ask, what does it mean for a human to have P, for a human to be intelligent or human to be creative? Well, it's what a British philosopher used to call, I forget his name now because I'm tired, essentially contested. It's not something on which we will all agree once and for all. There will always be someone who's saying, well, your way of accounting for the fact that humans are intelligent, I don't agree with. And it's all the more so for creativity, I think. And then there's the fact that somehow humanity is, metaphorically speaking, baked into P. It's hard to put apart intelligence and humanity. Just try. The extreme case, of course, is humanness. You may want to ask, can a machine, can it have humanness? But of course, it's very difficult to pry away the fact of being a human and humanness. But whatever, this might be a little extreme, so let me move on to my strategy. So in both cases, whether intelligence or creativity, we start with a working definition of P of human from current literature or personal observation or philosophy or whatever. Then we try to separate P from human. And it's not easy, but we have to do it. And then we ask, of course, can a machine have P? And then the conclusion is either it's no, and actually it's usually pre-approved. I mean, people who launch into long considerations of whether a machine can be intelligent, in the back of their mind since the beginning, they were convinced that it cannot be. And so they give arguments or descriptions or observations, but really they haven't gained very much. Or it's, yes, indeed, a machine can be intelligent or a machine can be creative, but it's immediately contested. So there's constant perplexity. You certainly observe it for both intelligence regarding machines or LLMs and for creativity. You see it goes back and forth endlessly. I mean, how many words, how many sentences, how many lines have been spent on disagreeing? Not that it's not productive. It's productive to disagree, but the prospect of somehow coming to a consensual view about it are rather slim. So then you can change slightly the focus. You can ask for something that is to a machine what P is to human. So what would intelligence be to a machine? What intelligence is to a human? What would creativity be to a machine? what creativity is to a human. So by analogy, trying to tease out some notion that might indeed be taken as an ersatz for machines of the thing, of the real thing, the real McCoy, for human beings. So if it doesn't make much sense, it's not that important, because I'm going to try and illustrate the strategy now. So human intelligence, big topic. First of all, I give this quote by Daniel Andler, who's very respected, unfortunately diseased psychologist from Princeton, an extraordinarily intelligent person, who edited an enormous treatise on cognitive science in 4 volumes at MIT. That was 1995 or 1990. And this is what he said to introduce in his introduction to one of the volumes. He said, cognitive science is the study of human intelligence in all its forms, from perception and action to language and reasoning. The exercise of intelligence is called cognition. Now, the reason I quote this is that there is a tendency both in AI and cognitive science to just say there's nothing above and beyond intelligence than those various capacities, memory, computation, language understanding, planning, and so on. But really, I think that's missing what's essential about intelligence, which I see as the harmonious deployment in a certain context, in different contexts, of these various basic abilities. So from the start, we're on shaky grounds when we look either at AI or at cognitive science when we want to know what intelligence is. But again, this is preliminary, and I realize I should have skipped it in the interest of time. Sorry. So when we look at the current scientific psychology of intelligence, just one word about history. As you all know, intelligence was at the heart of scientific psychology in the beginning of the 20th century because of IQ, the French school of Binet, and so on. Then it was pushed aside by cognitive science for exactly the reason that is imminent in that, which is expressed in this quote that I gave from Andler just a slide ago. Cognitive science was interested in the building blocks of intelligence. It was not interested in intelligence as such. And because intelligence studies had failures and were contested, they were pushed aside towards industrial psychology, applied psychology. It was outside of serious theoretical academic psychology. Then it came back about 30 years ago, because of the work of Robert Sternberg, of James Flynn, and such people. And now there is a flourishing area of scientific psychology that works on intelligence, not on the building blocks, but on intelligence itself. And it's, I would say, generally defined in this branch as the ability to solve problems. That's the key concept. Various bells and whistles, by which I mean, it's American slang, by which I mean that the problems have to be varied, they have to be important, they can be solved elegantly or not. Different people solve it more or less well, and so on. But basically, it's the idea that intelligence is about problem solving. But what is meant by a problem? And this is the heart of my theory. So if it doesn't fly, that's the end of my theory. That's the end of my book. That's the end of my talk. So I attempt to distinguish 2 meanings of problem, which are related but are distinct. So in common parlance, and it goes back to the 15th century, a problem is just a difficulty, a conflict, something that gets in your way, that you're not happy about. That's the broad sense of problem. Then there's the more restricted, strict sense of problem, which is the act of bringing forth a question for consideration. We're pro-balein, you're all Greek, so you speak ancient Greek, to throw forward, to propose. So the master proposes and the pupil searches. So it consists in a precise statement, which is understood in the same way by the master and the pupil. There is a unique solution, or maybe a family of solutions, but let's keep it simple. A unique solution, initially unknown by the pupil, but recognizable by anyone. Statement and solutions are impersonal. That's crucial. Equation x squared minus x plus 3x equals 0 is the same whether it's been asked 2,000 years ago in China or whether it's asked today in a Greek high school. Whoever asks the question, whoever solves the equation, they're completely the same, invariant through the various people who take on the problem. And they are independent of context. So there was this interesting talk about context and cotext. I've done a lot of work on context, not necessarily good, but I've worked a lot on context. And on my website, you can find a number of texts on context. But I just mean it in more or less the ordinary sense. Context is everything that comes about that hasn't been perhaps initially formulated in the problem, but which can be reintegrated. So sometimes it happens that the teacher forgot to say that he's looking only for real solutions and not complex solutions. So that was something in the context. Now, a good pupil raises his hand. Sir, do you mean a real solution or also complex solutions? And then the teacher will say, oh, only real solutions I'm interested in. And then at that point, once the various elements of context that have perhaps been left on the side in the initial formulation of the problem become integrated in the full formulation of the problem. So I'm going to generalize this notion of a problem. It's obviously very idealized, very simple, and so on, but I think it's it's a good basis for generalization. And I think, and that's the heart of my thesis, that human intelligence is not about solving problems. And here I'm quoting Robert Sternberg, who was instrumental, I mentioned his name earlier, was instrumental in bringing the study of intelligence back into the mainstream of academic psychology, and who produced over a 40 or 45 year-long career a bunch of theories about intelligence, pretty much inspired by the problem solving and the cognitive science inspired information processing inspired current of thought. And towards the end of he's alive, as far as I know, but he was becoming a little aged and sort of came back on what he had himself been producing for decades, models of intelligence. And this is what he said, which struck me when I found this quote. Somehow in the years since the work of Alfred Binet, the meaning of intelligence has largely been trivialized and arguably lost. And in a way, although I'm not a psychologist of intelligence, this is what my intuition was when I ran into those definitions of intelligence as problem solving. So I think that intelligence is indeed the art of solving a problem, but not in the restricted sense. And that's essential. It might sound like a nuance, we're all tired and so on, but it's essential, it's crucial. It's the most crucial part of my talk. I think it's the generalization of the first meaning of problem. And this generalization is as follows. I think that intelligence is the ability to deal with situations appropriately, to do the right thing. There was someone said about doing the right thing. So doing the right thing. So, of course, I have to say a little bit, just as I attempted to make precise a technical sense of problem, statement, pupil, and so on, I have to make precise what I mean by situation. So I think of situation as a singular, time and place indexed, potentially infinite set of circumstances centered on a person as perceived by that person, or understood or construed, and which engages her. She has a stake and calls for an action. Now, this is a lot of stuff, very heavy, but you can rely on an example. This is what you're most familiar with as human beings. Each and every one of you, from moment to moment, knows what a situation is, lives a situation. Right now, I'm living a situation. I'm trying to, this is not the first time that I talk to an audience. Of course, there are types of situation, but this is the one time. It's about 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock, I don't know now. It's here in the Goethe Institute in Athens on a certain day, in a certain place, and in a certain set of circumstances. And I have a stake. I want to do the best I can, right? It's centered on me. I'm mostly worried about me, a little bit worried about you, but mostly worried about me. And similarly, each of you is in a situation, although you're not extremely active, you're less active than I am right now, but still you're in a situation. You've heard many lectures, but this is the one lecture you're hearing right now, and you're trying to do the right thing. It's rather banal. It just means looking intelligent, trying not to fall asleep, being polite, not starting screaming at the speaker, and so on. But you're doing the right thing. So this is what I mean by situation. And I think of a situation as a gestalt, a set, a form, essentially, made up of lots of little circumstances, lots of features of the environment, some of which are relevant and others aren't relevant. For example, let's see, the color of the wood paneling is not really relevant, although it's there. It could become relevant if we saw things in a different light. But right now, as I live my situation, and you live presumably your situation, the color of the wood paneling, it could be much lighter, it would make no difference. So each feature, whether it's external, the wood paneling, or internal, which is my state of mind, my memories, my fear of making a fool of myself, and so on, each of them is potentially relevant, but actually only relevant with respect to the situation. And there's a back and forth. It's the well-known holism problem, or situation, in fact, predicament, where the importance, the relevance of each detail depends on the whole, and the whole depends on the relevance of the details that you've chosen. So, and the last trait of a situation, but I won't make much of it in the sequel, but I think it's important to mention it. A situation is always oriented. First of all, you come from a certain place in space, and you come from a certain place in time. I mean, all the past until this very moment when I'm talking to you, right? And it's projected because, I mean, the minute after, I'm going to try and do the right thing, or I'll be in another set of circumstances, and so on. So a situation is also potential for future action, future attitudes, and so on. So I think that's important, too. There's a destination in space and time in the idea of a situation. So being in a situation and dealing with a situation. Being in a situation initially is by no choice of ours. I mean, we're thrown into a situation and we immediately perceive it in a certain sense. We walk into a bar, for example, and we see things as we see them, as potentially dangerous or welcoming or whatever. But after that, so that's the passive moment of being in a situation. And we are, as humans, and I would argue very much as animals in general, this applies to animals as well, we are situation sensitive. We immediately grasp something that we are involved in or have just become involved in. And then we deal with the situation, and this is maybe what we humans have as opposed to, say, other animals. We become aware of the perspectival or situational nature of what we perceive in the broadest sense as what we construe when we come into that bar or when one of you comes into my talk, right? And then we become aware that we can modify the situation by ways of pure mental agency. That's the active moment of dealing with a situation. And then, of course, I'm sort of decomposing things. It all happens more or less at once, on a sort of movement, continuous movement. We act appropriately. Appropriately, that's crucial. Appropriately means that it's the right thing to do. Well, we haven't made much progress. So what do we mean by that? Well, we try to, well, a natural answer would be, well, there's something that's just the right thing to do because it's adaptive or it conforms to a set of constraints. Well, that can be the case often. The right thing to do if my situation is that my teacher asked me to solve the equation x squared minus x plus 2 equals 0, maybe the thing to do is to start working, reasoning, and getting the answer right. But it could also be something else. Because maybe in the classroom, one pupil suddenly had an epileptic fit. And then the thing to do is not to work on the solution of the equation, but to try and help that person. Or maybe there's suddenly a cry outside, there's a demonstration, there's a fire, and so on. So the point is, the general point is that there is generally not a single right thing to do. It's something that's normative. Now, of course, getting the right answer to an equation, the correct root to an equation is normative, but it's weakly normative. It's normative in a sense where a thermostat says, you know, the temperature of the room should be 21 degrees. So everyone agrees on it, it's objective, and so on. Well, the right thing to do, the appropriateness of an action following in a given situation is something that by principle, is up for grabs. It's something that can be discussed, even if in practice it's not necessarily discussed. It can always be in principle discussed. In other words, it's what I call a strong norm. A strong norm is, we have examples of strong norms, although the thorough naturalist that I'm not, the thorough naturalist will say there are no strong norms. In fact, it's a big part of their argument that there are no strong norms. All strong norms are reducible to weak norms, objective norms. But I don't believe that. I'm not in that camp. And I think that the ethical norm, the aesthetic norm are strong norms, always up for grabs, always the open-ended argument for philosophers. Okay, and so the situationality is both the capacity to be in a situation, to be situation sensitive, as I call it, and the capacity to deal with a situation by being subject to this norm that I want to act appropriately, I want to do the right thing. So, by the way, how am I doing? Oh, terrible. Okay, so where's the argument? Well, obviously, I'm not going to spend I wasn't planning to spend a lot of time on the argument. It's obviously, you know, a book-length argument. You can read my book if you want. I would say there are two kinds of arguments that come easily to mind. One is the evolutionary argument. It seems that what keeps us busy, us animals move. And they move in an environment which is unpredictable and which is changing. And what you want to possess in that kind of situation is precisely situationality, the ability to grasp a novel set of circumstances and to act on it mentally in the case of humans, maybe not in the case of other animals, and act appropriately. So I think that evolution did the job of providing us with this general capacity, which I think is essentially intelligence. And then there's just an observation from everyday life. We do our best. That's what we do every day, pretty much, to move from a given situation to a better one, to something appropriate, which is going to get us in a better situation, or at least prevent the situation from getting worse. So it appears as the essential dynamics of existence. So that's obviously an oversimplification, but I'll move on to the next slide, in which I admit easily, freely admit that oftentimes the right thing to do in a situation is to pose a problem, very important, and then solve it. You know, if I don't know, if there's a crisis in the office, everyone is in a bad mood, someone came late, someone spilled some coffee, and it's a situation, you're the head of the team, it's a situation, and the rational thing to do, the appropriate thing to do is to say, well, calm down, people, let's all sit around a table and try and work out what the problem is, and then we find a solution maybe in the human relations within the team. But sometimes several problems, there are different ways of looking at a problem, at a situation, different ways of posing a problem, different problems that can be posed, and sometimes none. Sometimes the right attitude in a situation is to endure it. Wait until things get better. There's no problem to be posed, no problem to be solved. So, of course, the posing is essential. I mean, that's something that seems simple enough. I mean, you can have very simple discussions about AI, and if, you know, with luck, you're going to get your interlocutor to say, yes, of course, posing the problem is not something that AI does. AI solves the problem. And posing a problem is not just a meta problem. I mean, it's not, you could say, well, come on, there's a problem, there's a situation. You want to find the right problem to solve, whose solution would lead to a better situation. So that's just a meta problem. And I have arguments to show that it's not at all a meta problem. So quickly, in 2 minutes, can I cheat for a few minutes? I'm sorry. Creativity, problem solving, and situationality. So first of all, as one gentleman, I think it was you, saying that it's better to talk about, it's more productive. I mean, it's okay to look at the products of the creative process and to ask whether these products are indeed creative. Is Chopin's music creative? Is it any more creative than Bach? Is it any more creative than the Beatles, and so on? It's a way you can go, but I think it's more productive, more central to look at the process that lead to the creative works. So I want to focus on the process rather than product. And my heuristic is as follows. As I say, creativity and intelligence at least intersect. Intelligence at least involves problem solving, but does not stop at that, according to me. Creativity, as you know, from art history and also from theories of science, involves problem solving, according to many accounts. But then, because I connect creativity and intelligence, I'm not the only one to do that, it just suggests, as a heuristic again, it's not a proof, that creativity, just as, according to me, intelligence certainly involves problem solving, but involves something more. I think it's the same. It's something to look for. Maybe creativity also involves something more than problem solving. And so the question is, well, what would that element of situationality be that has a role to play in creativity? So let me show you a simple slide, which I will try and explain in a few seconds. So I think, I mean, this is going to sound very primitive and probably naive to you, but I think of the writer who gets up in the morning and has a blank page, or it can be a musician, or it can be a painter, and so on. So he or she is in a certain situation. You know, the blank page is this morning, she wants to be creative, she has something to produce. And she might, according to my scheme, either enter problem-solving mode. So she puts on blinkers. Blinkers means that she focuses on a few elements. I want to do a fugue. It shouldn't be too long. It should be very different from Bach's whatever, etc., etc. So I enter a problem-solving mode. I push out of the picture, out of my consciousness, all the other possible elements. And I seek for a solution, and sometimes I find a solution, and then I'm fine. I am in a new situation in which I can send my paper and my sheet of music to the composer or the printer. Or maybe I cannot find a solution, and then I remove my blinkers and I get into a reassessment mode. I broaden my horizon. And then once I've broadened my horizon, I can find a solution. If I produce something, then I am being creative in a fairly limited sense of creation, which I call C. And if not, well, I have failed. So I'm in a situation which is like the previous situation, except that my first attempt failed. Now, suppose that doesn't work. Then I can enter, or maybe I do it right away because I'm Picasso, I'm Chopin, I'm Van Gogh, etc. I enter what I call a form-finding mode. I look for a new form. So I don't have a problem in mind, even broadened with contextual elements. I seek inspiration, basically. I look for a new form. And if I don't find the new form, I failed again. But if I find a form, then something interesting happens. I look for a problem. I say, this form potentially is the solution to a certain problem. So you see, the problem comes after, rather than first a problem and then a solution. First a form, which is something like the beginning of a solution, and then a problem. Now, if I find a problem, I'm happy, and I've sort of expanded somehow my creativity, and I get to a higher form of creativity, I claim. Again, with, reservations about my own judgment. Or there doesn't even exist a problem. And you can think of the greatest works of art. And then I think there's radical novelty, and you get the highest level, so to speak, of creativity. So, in order to go through these motions, it seems that there are several requirements. First of all, the would-be creator, whether she's self-consciously aiming to be creative, typically the artist, or not as such, but as a personal contribution to her craft. Bach is not saying, I want to be a great composer. Bach is saying, I want to contribute to the art of the fugue, right? Or just doing the best at the task, her best at the task at hand. So she is striving. She has a dog in the fight, so to speak, which is herself. So she has a self. This is why my requirement is the 3S, stake, striving, and self. The second requirement, it seems to be, is open-endedness. So the slide in which there were all these things 2 slides ago was supposed to show that if you're just trying to reach a given model within the constraints, you get not a real creation, you get something like formulaic art. And you wouldn't, the person, the artist, would not care very much any more than completing a crossword puzzle or Sudoku. Creativity necessitates a sense of open-endedness, an ability to seek an indefinite endpoint, reconsidering the situation, changing format, inventing a form from scratch. The third requirement is cognitive autonomy, the ability to willfully reassess one's situation, not directly aiming at one particular situation, nor aiming at any different situation, just nudging oneself by both voluntary rational means and semi-voluntary attitudinal techniques towards a gestalt change. And finally, perhaps the most important with the first is value sensitivity. You have to possess a strongly normative concept of value, which includes the notion of a debate among arbiters, others, potential and actual and self. Bach is keenly aware that his view could be better, could be regarded as less original or more original, or is sometimes very happy about what he's come about. And to be able to apply it to the evaluation of one's productions, and in particular, importantly, having a sense of progress. So this sense of progress is very much, but I'm ahead of myself, lacking in AI creativity. There's no progress in AI creativity. So creativity for AI, and I'll try and finish in a few moments. So first of all, what an AI system does, I've already said that, find solutions to certain kinds of problems. That's how AISs are used. Just look at what you do when you use an LLM or any other system, and just look at existing AISs one by one and check that they're all solving problems or realizing specified tasks. Now I'm going to almost skip this this slide, which to some of you who've followed me up to now, brave you, you might think is the most important. I mean, not for nothing has LLMs or have generative AI raised the issue of artificial general intelligence, the sparks of AGI, that is more or less human-like intelligence, because precisely on the surface it seems that they're not solving a specific problem, they're producing stuff, they're creating forms, right? So the standard condition for being a problem in this strict sense does not seem to be filled by generative AI. So of course, you can look at how it happens. You look under the hood and you see that really it's optimizing a certain probability distribution subject to certain constraints. Well, if you just leave it at that, it's a little bit weak as an answer, but let me quickly suggest a better retort. I'm saying that ChatGPT and all the Midjourney and other generative AI systems' proper function, what they've have been built to do, is to produce text or images or videos that best fit the specifications. And they do it by way of assembling the most probable missing pieces. But that is the problem they're solving. So it looks like different from the standard notion of problem, but that's because there's a fuzzy set of admissible responses with correspondingly fuzzy verification procedure. So, and notice that for an AI system, an LLM, for example, any one item in the set is just as good as any other. It doesn't care. You know, it proposes this version of a love letter to your deceased wife, for example, in the style of Chaucer, and it can produce 6 or 7 or 10 of those, and it doesn't care one way or another. They're all equivalent for it. So there's an impression of creativity, and there's an impression, intuitively at least, of something missing. So AI is situation blind. They cannot be in a situation because they lack personhood, stake, the ability to seek an indefinite endpoint, cognitive autonomy, autonomous perspective forming, if you want, and strong value sensitivity and a sense of progress. Hence, they're barred from creativity, or at least from a kind of creativity that sufficiently resembles human creativity. So if I now go to, so in a way, this is my answer to the first kind of question. And now I look for something a little more subtle, which is the analogy. So what is to AI what creativity is to human? And that's a reasonable question, because obviously not all AI systems are creative, right? I mean, the standard problem solving of symbolic AI of the 60s and 70s and 80s are obviously not creative at all, while LLMs look like they're creative. So it's a reasonable question to ask. So there are two ways of, two directions to seek. One is just too hard for me to grasp, but I sense it. It would be an intrinsic analog, and if there are still computer scientists in the audience, theoretical computer science, they might help me on that. there would be something like a special computational capacity, an objective computational capacity, which is independent of human judgment. So in the direction of the halting problem, in the direction of algorithmic complexity theory, there might be something to be found there, but then the connection with the problems of AI creativity, as usually understood by you and me, doesn't seem clear at all. So I'll leave this path open. So what remains are what I might call extrinsic analogs. So some generative or others artificial intelligence systems, I've mistyped. For example, AlphaGo, AlphaFold, and so on, are in a certain sense creative, but they're not standard generative AI. So the capacity to generate surprising entities, the capacity to generate pleasing entities, the capacity to generate original entities, where of course those modifiers, surprising, pleasing, original, are observer relative. Who is surprised, pleased, struck by novelty, which doesn't make these criterion uninteresting, but just fragile, because it depends on the observer. So essentially, these processes or these systems, LLMs and so on, can to some extent fill the function of surprising, pleasing, striking as novel human observers. They don't seem to give rise to marked qualitative difference such as C, C+, and C++ in the human case. They lack the other characteristics of human creative processes. They lack robustness. When you look at human creativity, you have various ways of looking at it. For example, one way that you have is to place the efforts of the artist in her historical context and development, in the context of the school she belongs to, in the context of her professors and so on. So all of this helps you evaluate the creativity or the creativeness of the person. There's no such thing for an AI system. So finally, they're subject to breakdown. They can easily produce worthless stuff. We've seen this already. They can be easily diverted to non-creative ends, slop, fakes, and so on. And they require enormous enabling conditions in the form of data centers, hundreds of workers of the click, hundreds of engineers, and so on and so forth. That's typical of an ersatz. So it's an ersatz. So there's nothing wrong in general about being an ersatz. To say that something is an ersatz is not saying it's worthless. For example, if you have a hip made of steel of titanium, you're very happy to have and I have a friend who just had a heart operation with an ersatz valve, keeps him alive. I'm very happy for this. There are lots and lots of useful ersatzes. In fact, you might look, and I think it goes in the direction of something one person on the panel said, in a way, the history of humanity is the manufacture, the imagining or the creating, in fact, of one ersatz after the other. So we're all for ersatzes. It's a good idea to have an ersatz. But some ersatzes are not so interesting. And AI creativity, as I said, is an ersatz, but it seems to be on the sort of lower end of interestingness in terms of ersatz. So my conclusion is that human creativity is not about to be supplanted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Andler, for your very insightful and very optimistic in many different levels talk. Περνάμε σε σύντομες ερωτήσεις και απαντήσεις προς τον καθηγητή. Μας παρουσίασε μια αισιόδοξη πλευρά διαχωρισμού της ανθρώπινης δημιουργικότητας με αυτό που, αν μπορούσαμε να τολμήσουμε να πούμε, τεχνητή δημιουργικότητα ή τέλος πάντων τεχνητή παραγωγικότητα, και κατέληξε σε συγκεκριμένες περίπτωσεις. Ωραία, ξεκινάμε κατευθείαν με τις ερωτήσεις. Ο Αντώνης, ο κύριος Χατζημούρη. Και να πάρουμε και...
Right, thank you very much for this very rich talk. A clarificatory question. Is your view that the term intelligent functions not as a predicative but as an attributive term? It's not like square and circular, but like big and small. So we cannot answer correctly whether X is intelligent until we know what the nature of X is. Is this how your epistemology works on this?
Yeah, I guess I would go along with that. Yes, exactly. Oops, sorry. Yeah, I would go along with this. It's a little bit what Sternberg calls that intelligence is not an intrinsic property of the person. He says it's a task cross person cross. I've forgotten. Anyway, that's right. Exactly his view.
And okay, to continue on this thought. Is intelligence at the level of system capacities or at the level of how the system conducts itself, how it behaves in light of what it encounters?
I think it's both. It reminds me of Herbert Simon's image of I can't remember whether it's a car or it's an ant, but the ant or the car has a certain capacity, abstract capacity, which makes it able to move once it's put on the ground. So it's a mix of the two. Yeah.
That's fine. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I don't know if it's a good question, a right question, but would you presumably attribute an objective value scaling to human creativity versus the AI creativity? Is there such a thing as an objective value structure, attributed to human creativity?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I really don't have a well-informed answer. My intuition, and I tried to sort of give with my C++, C++, an idea of certain degrees of creativity, and I think that would not be contested, but by, it's the same by the way, in science. I mean, for example, I'm a former mathematician. I was never on the high scale of creativity, although I did prove one theorem. So it made me a C or C minus creative mathematician. But there's an extremely strong sense in mathematics of deep creators, deep mathematicians, and then transcendent mathematicians. I mean, no one has any doubt that Grothendieck was unique or quasi-unique or Gauss. And then below that, there's some extraordinary mathematicians way beyond the ordinary mathematician who would be C+, and then beyond that, there's sort of the run-of-the-mill mathematicians, more or less gifted. So there's certainly a strong sense, I think maybe also the same in physics, but certainly in mathematics. So there's a strong sense of that, and I suppose that in art or art history, art theory, there's similar things whereby, there are minor painters and major painters and great painters. So I think there is such a thing, a scale. Then whether it can be objectively measured, I have my doubts about that, but I know too little about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So thank you very much, Daniel.
We are here.
Sorry, I can come up to.
Yes. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your really rich talk, and I think I find everything really convincing you say in creativity. So this is really great. A question with regard to intelligence, which you obviously worked on a lot, but the question I'm having with this concept is sometimes, I very much agree, like it's reduced to problem solving and really formulating the problem is like where most of the mental work lies. And that's really like the essence of what we expect when we ask for intelligence. And I loved how fast you were at the situation, like something where we are as embodied beings and have to orient ourselves in a more or less unknown space, and how it's connected to action. And I sometimes wonder about the concept of intelligence, if it's maybe just like an invention, something that we try to find behind certain mental capacities, but in some abstract form, and that might be something we would be better to do without, especially since it has been appropriated by psychology or a certain way of psychology and as a problem-solving capacity, which then, of course, is tested on in a numerical value, which then we can compare the machine, what's the intelligence value there, and with the human, and but it's like so many different capacities, mental capacities that are all thrown together, and then of course it becomes very unsharp and confusing.
Oh, perfect. I love your question. Absolutely. This is, I mean, what you just said explains why the concept of intelligence is elusive, as I often say. It's something like the circumstantial, harmonious development or deployment of a variety of capacities. Sometimes it's memory, sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. And so it's a fairly abstract term. So when you say invention, I go along with that. Yes, it is it's a kind of invention. As I say, I sometimes compare it to orchestra. The violin, the trumpet, the piano, and so on. There, each of the musician contributes the harmony. But then sometimes it all comes out harmoniously, and sometimes less harmoniously, and we recognize this. And the conductor recognizes this. He said, "Today wasn't such a good day. I don't exactly know why, but it wasn't such a good day." So I completely agree. Thank you. I see it as a friendly contribution.
Okay. Ολοκληρώνουμε.
I'm very brief. Thank you very much, Daniel. I just want to thank you, actually, very much, especially for this very clear chain of arguments, at least for me, and this metaphors with the prosthesis. I like it very much. And really to light up kind of the Olympic torch and, yeah, how to say, some very solid reason, not only hope, but really solid reason for humans and human creation and creativity. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for your remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.